The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Hi, welcome to the latest episode of Mental Health Now. I'm your host, Matthew Shapiro from the National Alliance on Mental Illness New York State, NAMI. Before we start, really quick, on our last episode, we discussed our NAMI walks, which was a tremendous success, and I want to thank everyone from the Capital Region who came out and helped make it the inspiring event that it was. Moving on today's episode, I'm very honored to be joined by Dr. Lloyd Sederer, author of the new book, Improving Mental Health, The Four Secrets in Plain Sight. Dr. Sederer is the medical editor for mental health of the Huffington Post, adjunct professor for the Columbia School of Public Health, and the chief medical officer of the New York State Office of Mental Health. So he has a lot of titles. He's a fantastic author, and I just finished reading the book, and it was fantastic. Dr. Sederer is also going to be one of our featured speakers this year at our NAMI New York State Education Conference, which is going to be taking place November 11th through 13th, right at the Desmond Hotel in Albany. And Dr. Sederer is going to be speaking on Saturday, November 12th from 2:45 to 4 p.m. And while we'd love to have people attend the whole conference, you can just register for a single day if you're so inspired hearing Dr. Sederer today that you want to come see him and learn more about the work he's doing. So welcome, Dr. Sederer.
Well, it's great to be here, Matt, and I think NAMI is such a fantastic organization, and we all benefit so much, including my agency, because of how much you contribute to the lives of people with mental illness.
Well, thank you so much, and you've been a big help for that too. This is actually your second book. Your first book, which we give to families all the time, The Family Guide to Mental Health Care, is a fantastic resource. It's helped so many families, especially as they enter the process of caring for a loved one. So thank you for all the tremendous work you're doing.
It's my privilege, my privilege.
Well, as I say, I really enjoyed the book, and I just want to start by reading the foreword, which was written by Patrick Kennedy, a former congressman, son of Senator Ted Kennedy, who's become a leading mental health advocate. And he says, at the heart of his message is the fundamental recognition of the dignity and worth of each person, both practitioner and patient. As Dr. Sederer acknowledges, no one chooses to have a mental illness or addiction. We are all wired for human connection, to love and be accepted. Knowing the biological basis for these illnesses is only the first step in treating them, and traditionally medical response is only one leg of the stool. Any comprehensive treatment must include a strong psychosocial component. And I couldn't agree more with this sentiment and this statement. It's really your view for psychiatric care, and something we frequently say at NAMI New York State is that the spectrum of psychiatric disorders is so broad that you have to really look at each person as an individual and their set of symptoms individually and tailor the care to their specific needs. You know, the sign behind it says promoting your recovery. And this sounds like such an obvious approach, but in reality it's kind of a new one. And not that long ago, most people would say schizophrenia would all receive the same treatment, which is the one leg that Congressman Kennedy referred to. Can you elaborate on this a bit?
Of course. So first I just want to say how honored I am that Patrick Kennedy wrote the forward and that he wanted to. It wasn't like I had to twist his arm. I'd gotten to know him in recent years, and he knew about this book and read it, and he said, I'd like to do that, and so I'm very honored about that. But your point here about an over-reliance on one leg of the stool has been, unfortunately, too much of general practice. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, because there's so much more that can be done. And in that first book, The Family Guide, I emphasized an approach to care that I think speaks to what you're talking about, that there are certain basic principles principles of care, of what quality is like in patient care, and that's what people who have mental illness and that's what their families should understand and look for, and they're very understandable. Treatment should be comprehensive. It should look at different parts of the person and different ways that treatment can be provided, and provide those in many ways, because one treatment is not as good as having medications, having skill building, having family work. You put these all together, the effect is much greater. Comprehensive treatment, continuous treatment, which is not treatment that starts and stops, because with any persistent illness, you've got to take care of the illness, and the person needs to take care of themselves in an ongoing way, continuous treatment. Then we also know a lot about what works, and we call that evidence-based or evidence-informed treatment. So treatment should be, whenever possible, supported by evidence about what works. Then also we've got to take advantage of the fact that the greatest and most enduring support that people with mental illness can have is from their families. So we've got to be inclusive of families. We've got to help people who are even afraid to involve their families understand that their families can be very helpful in most cases. Not in every case, but in most cases. And then probably one of the last legs, there probably are more, and I'm sure you'll emphasize this, which is that a treatment or an approach with a clinician has to be based in hope. That we've got to all start off believing that this may be a serious illness, but we have reason to be hopeful. We have reason to build a plan that will make a difference in how somebody lives.
Right. And one of the things, too, again, the name of the book, Improving Mental Health, The 4 Secrets in Plain Sight, which will be available in the middle of November, but you can pre-order it now on Amazon.com, and we encourage everyone to read it, is that there really is something for providers, for clinicians, family members, and the individuals themselves, which is so exciting. So I want to just jump in and talk about the 4 secrets individually. The first one is behavior serves a purpose. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Yes. I hope everybody is curious about what the secrets are, and their secrets that I emphasize are in plain sight. None of these should be a surprise to any of us, but the fact is that they're seldom considered and unevenly considered. So my effort here is to bring them much more out into the open and make people aware of that. But behavior serves a purpose. This is the first secret. And what I mean by that is that often, particularly with mental disorders, but neurological disorders, other conditions as well, somebody behaves in a certain way, and we can't make any sense of it. It doesn't seem reasonable. It doesn't seem reasonable that they're so afraid, they're so anxious, or they're so paranoid, or for that matter, they're afraid to eat, like in anorexia nervosa.
And you make a very good comparison in this chapter, comparing schizophrenia and anorexia nervosa. Excuse me, got a little tongue-tied there, but because I think for the outside world, like you say, it's something that might be in plain sight, but very hard for people to comprehend that thought process behind both those diseases.
And that is really where both families and clinicians, I believe, need to start, because fundamental to building an alliance, a working alliance with somebody, as a family member or as a clinician, is that they gain trust in you, and they gain trust in you if you seek to understand what they're doing, which they themselves may not understand. So starting out with the premise that this behavior is serving that person. It may be helping them avoid an anxiety that they can't bear. It may be helping them defend against a paranoid view that somebody is going to hurt them, or it may be protecting them from a panicky feeling when they put something close to their mouth to eat. It's serving a purpose. We need to understand that, and we need to say, help me understand what goes on at that moment with you. Let's look at that together. Let's figure out a better way of your managing how you feel, because what you're doing now is the best that you may be doing, but you know it's not working well enough for you.
Right. And one thing that you said in the book, which I thought was so interesting, that it's essential for clinicians and loved ones to appreciate what purpose and purposes are served when a person with mental illness engages in behaviors that seem to defy reason. You know, a lot of times we talk with families that it's hard to try to reason with people who can be unreasonable, but this does talk to a need that NAMI talks about a lot, which is the need for recovery teams.
Yes.
The people living with the mental illness, their family members, and their clinicians working together as a recovery team with shared goals and open communication to drive the recovery. And that's something which will also be a featured session at our education conference. We have a whole panel discussion featuring each members of the team and discussing how that is the best
I'm glad
approach.
you touched, because I forgot one of the other principles, which was what you just mentioned, which is shared decision making. That decisions are best made when they're made principally by the person who's going to be affected, and we've got to approach that as well. And good recovery work is based on that as well.
Yeah, and of course a lot of this too, and when we talk about this, especially the first steps, and one of the things that's really impressive is the book is the way you use case studies, and there was the one with the mother who was experiencing anxiety, and she had a single mother who had younger children, that I think was very hard for her co-workers and her children to understand what's going on, and I think it was hard for her to understand what's going on, and lack of insight with someone living with a mental illness is a serious barrier, and something that both clinicians, families, and the person themselves, of course, have to overcome. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that case example was of a woman in her 40s with depression, with children, single mom, but employed, and her depression had become so severe and her anxiety so great that she was afraid to go to work. She was afraid to go to work because when she went to work, she couldn't perform, and she was a highly responsible, capable person, and so she was mortified when she would sit there at her desk and think, I just can't concentrate, I just can't do the work. So she was afraid of essentially shaming herself at her own job, and then she employed, and this is where the behavior serves a purpose, she employed the best strategy that we all have to avoid being afraid of something, which is to avoid it. It's the most effective strategy. It's not a very good long-term strategy, but it works very well in the short term.
Right. I want to jump ahead. This is so challenging because I think we could do a show on each one of the secrets. Like I said to you again, the name of the book, Improving Mental Health, The 4 Secrets in Plain Sight, which will be available in November. You can pre-order it now on Amazon. Is what I'm going to do. I think I'm going to talk about the second and the fourth together because they kind of go together. I want to make sure we have enough time to discuss in detail what I really found to be the most compelling secret, and that was, as a rule, less is more, and how this is kind of aligned to the physician's code of do no harm. So can you explain what you meant by that?
Yes, so there's a long history in medicine, not just psychiatric medicine, but general medicine, particularly even cancer, which is that if a little bit works, a lot more is going to work a lot better. And once in a while that's the case, but more often than not, it is not the case. And there's a whole history in cancer treatment of effective doses of chemotherapy and then high doses as a consequence, which were very toxic, not more effective. The same thing about radical surgeries as well. And in our field, a certain amount of medication, if a little bit amount of medications work well, maybe a lot will work better. And that's not the case at all. And in fact, it brings on so many side effects, and it also makes somebody feel so awful that they don't want any treatment at all. So that's an example of how good intentions, this is not bad doctors or badly intended doctors, but they're trying to do more, but the trap is that sometimes more is not more, it's less.
Right. And actually the great quote that really jumped out for me from this section was, when a disease defies efforts at cure because it is not well understood or its therapeutics remain limited or rudimentary, there is a powerful human tendency to up the ante. Do more, do something radical, take unusual measures to effect improvement, and are among the human drives to be reckoned with because they provide help, they provide help infrequently and often have unwarranted and problematic effects, which is what you were just saying.
I'm glad I wrote that.
Yeah, well, no, it's very powerful. It's true. I think there is that human. We all want to be able to do more and do the most that we can, but sometimes you have to know.
And the same is also true with certain psychotherapies. And there's a long history where we had intensive psychotherapies, heavily explorative psychotherapies, particularly with fragile people with trauma, people with psychosis. This is not good for them. Or meeting frequently. We need much more practical approaches, much more skill-building approaches. This is where a different kind of care is a lot more.
Right. And I think there was one example that you used here, which was very good. You actually referred to a patient that you had in the late 70s named Susan, and her experience being prescribed, is it Nordil?
Yes.
And that caused her to have blood pressure issues. And there were two key takeaways I got away from this story. One, you say, she was a trooper, and I was able to gain some of her trust. The second one thing that you said was, which was an important lesson for you, and one that physicians are now prescribing nurses, because I think it's important to point out, I think a lot of times people think they need to go to a psychiatrist to get care, but there are nurse practitioners and other ways to get medications.
Absolutely.
We can discuss that as well. But anyone prescribing medicine needs to learn to start low, go slow, because when it comes to many medication, you want to see how it affects that person. So the two takeaways here, like last episode we had Keith O'Neill, who was an NFL player who was retired and has bipolar disorder, and he really discussed the need for the fortitude and tenacity needed during the recovery process. So can you talk about that necessity as well as the importance of building a trust between a doctor and a patient, and this low and slow approach, both to, as we said, medication, and you kind of already touched on psychotherapy.
Right, yes, but that stamina, that capability, some people call that resilience, and it exists in all of us to more or less degree, and we need to look for that in somebody. We need to figure out ways that support their resilience. Who are the people that care about them? How can they spend time with them? How can they do things that make themselves healthier and therefore consequently stronger? And how can we convey hope to somebody so that they trust that the treatment is going to work, because it takes time and it takes a lot of work, and that's where stamina, that's where resilience is enhanced if people believe, well, it may be hard, but I can get through it. The second part of your question again was?
Building trust.
Building trust, yes. And building trust, I think, comes slowly. Trust has to be earned between a patient and a clinician, but it can be achieved, and when it does, then when something goes wrong or something just doesn't work well enough, as it does, then the patient can say, well, it's maybe this just a bump in the road. I got a good clinician, I've got a good partnership here, let's keep going.
Right, and it's kind of a three-way trust too, as we talked about the recovery teams.
Yes.
Everyone has to be able to trust each other and know that everyone has the individual's best interests in mind. And again, this open communication and shared dialogue to get the different perspectives. But that relationship, the core of it is trust, and that it's a trial and error. A lot of times medications fail, psychotherapies fail. You have to be able to do different things, and just the ability to stay with it, I think, is one of the most important.
And to believe that the people serving you are doing that in your interest, not in their own interest.
Correct. And one of the things in the section 2 is that you discuss a lot about the early onset psychosis and a lot of the breakthroughs we've had there, the National Institute of Mental Health's Recovery After Initial Schizophrenic Episode study, and really the game-changing work being done here in New York with On Track New York. So can you detail kind of...
I'm very proud of what's going on here in New York under the direction of Dr. Lisa Dixon, whom you know very well. Who's just a terrific, brilliant doctor. And we're determined to be able to provide early intervention for adolescents and young adults who are developing psychotic illness, because we know that when that happens, their life can be changed, that they're not going to necessarily head to a life of disability, which is what happens if they receive no care. But in order to get them care, and in order for them to stick with care, it's got to be different than we did conventionally. It's got to be much more focused on their school, on their work, on their family, We use medications, but we're very careful, low doses, so people don't feel awful. We do psychoeducation. So we meet people where they are, which is not necessarily in a clinic. It could be in a community center. It could be in a Starbucks. It's got to be much more natural approach, and that's what helps people, younger people, feel more comfortable and engage.
It's very person-centered, as it kind of spoke at the beginning. It's really trying to develop your specific recovery, not a one-size-fits-all approach.
And we've determined in New York State to make this available to everybody, from the far western parts to the far eastern parts of New York, and that's starting to happen. We have now, we're on our way towards 20 different sites.
Which is so exciting. And I highly encourage anyone who's interested in learning more to visit the On Track New York website, or NIMH has a RAISE study site as well that leads to On Track. There's some very powerful videos on there about people detailing the recovery. And I think a lot of times people think that recovery can only happen with less aggressive mental illnesses, but these are some of the worst types and the worst symptoms of schizophrenia. So that's exciting. And it's important to note as well how we kind of touched on research and how that can help the less is more theory. One thing we're very excited about with our annual education conference coming up is that we're going to have Dr. Bob Heinsohn, one of the leading researchers at NIMH, presenting on Saturday morning, and he'll be detailing, how better understanding of the brain and circuitry are going to lead to more tailored approaches. One thing
Bob Heinsohn was instrumental to national funding for early psychosis programs.
Yeah, and he's actually going to be talking about the next steps too with RAISE and where we go from here. And one of the things you talk about too in the book is the clinical antipsychotic trials of intervention effectiveness, or the CATIE study. Can we touch on that really quickly?
Yeah, that's another good example of less is more, because what that looked at was it compared traditional old first-generation antipsychotics with new ones, which would sometimes cost 100 times more. Sometimes that's worth it, but what the CATIE study showed was, first, about 74% of people didn't stick with the medication, principally because they had too many side effects or it wasn't working. The second was that overall, the first-generation medications, then Trilofan, perfenazine, which is as effective as the second-generation, olanzapine, risperidone, and that the only medicine that was distinctly better, particularly for people who didn't recover, was clozapine.
Okay, so we're actually running low on time. Like I said, it's going to be a challenge getting all this great information. So I do want to make sure we get to the second and fourth secrets, which in a way, like I said, do go hand in hand. The third one being the issue of attachment and relationships. And the fourth one, which is one that you would think would talk about plain sight, is that chronic stress is the enemy. I think it's funny, most people don't think stress is really a secret, but the way you detail the profound way that chronic and most serious forms of stress profoundly affect people, especially when it takes away from the attachment that someone would form at an early age. So
Right.
Can you discuss a little about
these are related in some ways, but the fourth one, chronic stress is the enemy, is not only, I think, the most powerful, but it's also an area where we can all take action and make a difference now. And what stress does, what chronic stress does, is it excites the inflammatory response in the body, which is normal if you have a cut or if you have a cold. But when it doesn't go away, what it does is it mobilizes all these corticosteroids, it raises blood pressure, raises heart rate, and it puts those nasty plaques in your heart. It stimulates too much insulin, so people become diabetic. It causes all kinds of physical problems, and it's now increasingly shown to be an instrumental part of depression, of not getting better from depression, of schizophrenia, PTSD. So chronic stress is the enemy both for physical and mental disorders, and it's an area where there's a lot of things we can do to mitigate our stress, anywhere from how we lead our lives to ways by which we control our drinking, our sleep, Eastern practices, meditation, mindfulness. There's a lot of ways to reduce chronic stress and to help prevent and also mitigate chronic disease. And the attachment, this is the most wonderful of all, because what it just simply says is human beings are are bond to each other. Our lives depend on each other, and those people who nurture relationships, who find good, healthy relationships, are the ones who are going to live the longest and the healthiest lives.
Right, and it's very interesting when you talk about the attachment. A lot of that's formed right at the beginning of life. You give that great example of the French movie with the young man.
Yeah, the enfant sauvage. This is the wild child. Yes.
Thank you. You say it much better than I do. My French leaves a lot to be desired. But that example, where a child who's been raised in the wilderness doesn't have that loving background in their upbringing, how that develops throughout their lives, and that lack of attachment at an early age, or if you have the attachment, that the stressor that takes that away, really can have an impact throughout their whole life. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yes. Well, one of the examples many people learned about in psychology were Harry Harlow's monkeys. So Harlow took little infant rhesus monkeys and he put them in settings where they either had a cloth mother or they had a wire mother. He separated them from their mother, so they had a disruption in their attachment. And what he demonstrated was that the ones who had a cloth monkey, a mother, did better, that they socialized with each other. The ones who had the wire monkey didn't. And in fact, when food was put with the wire monkey and food wasn't put with the cloth monkey, they still went to the cloth monkey. That attachment was to something soft and comforting was more important than food itself. That's an example from animal studies, but we also know that early disruptions in attachment, and we see this now with depression, depressed mothers are unable to effectively attach and develop and raise their young infant children. And when that happens, those kids have behavioral problems, emotional problems by the time they're 3 or 4.
It's very interesting, actually. I kind of fall into this category a little bit. There's been a lot of studies, mothers who have bipolar or depression tend to have children who have ADHD.
Yes.
And that's actually kind of my case. My mom, later in life, was diagnosed with depression, bipolar, eventually borderline as well, and I very early was diagnosed with ADHD, so it's kind of an interesting correlation. But one of the things we're very excited to present at our conference as well is a session on recognizing and addressing trauma in children. And you reference both the adverse childhood experience study and the effects of PTSD and that type of stress and trauma. And can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, that's such an important work that this goes back to late 90s, but where children who were exposed to neglect, to trauma, to very disruptive and violent households, were the kids by the time they were adolescents, had all kinds of physical problems. They were smokers. There was greater rates of teenage pregnancy. They had higher rates of depression, substance abuse, suicide attempts. That traumatic environment became encoded into their bodies and into the way that their health was affected, so that by the time they were teenagers and young adults, they had all of these problems, and that the more adverse experiences a child had, living in foster care, having domestic violence in the home, having a parent who was a drug addict, when you combine those, there was much more likelihood that they would be ill by the time they were teenagers.
It's so important to understand. We actually had a whole episode about mental health in children in schools and socioeconomic trauma too, but unfortunately we are out of time. I knew this was going to go quick. So much great stuff to cover. We're going to have to get you back. We talked about your movie reviews and some of the other great work you're doing. Again, the name of Dr. Sederer's book is Improving Mental Health Care, The 4 Secrets in Plain Sight. You can pre-order it now on Amazon. It will be out in the middle of November. We invite you to come see Dr. Sederer, our annual education conference, November 11th through 13th at the Desmond Hotel in Albany. And just finish off with our common saying, actually Dr. Sederer kind of touched on it, is something we say a lot at NAMI, is that hope starts with you. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Mental Health Now.